This is At Risk Radio.
Welcome to At Risk Radio. At Risk Radio is a show where we talk about leadership in the church at risk. My name is Mark Stafford, and I'm the host of the show. And I'm here with David Witt, and David Witt is the CEO of SOM International. David, I know around SOM International, every day is a day of prayer for the persecuted church, but we have a special day coming up, the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church on November 7th. David, tell us a little bit about why this rally event for the International Day of Prayer is so important, so vital to the ministry of Spirit of Martyrdom.
Yeah, this is a Sunday that the International Church, the body of Christ around the world, could come around and rally in solidarity for our persecuted brothers and sisters living in restricted nations, which, depending on what numbers you look at, is 250 million to 600 million Christians live in those regions and face difficulty for their faith. So that's a huge proportion, and something that as a body of Christ, we can have opportunity to show that we're one with them and we love them and we're praying for them. So we're inviting people to make an emphasis, even personally, and then for their fellowships, organizations, their churches, and we could be a resource for people to get involved.
So, David, what do these meetings often look like that people get together and do? Do they do prayer meetings? Do people do events? So what do these meetings typically look like when they're trying to honor those who are in chains for Jesus?
Well, I think most churches, first of all, just talk about they use the video. I mean, most churches, you use a video involved. We created a video that's 4 minutes long. It's really good with a great song this year, and people can get it off our internet. Many churches then will hand out prayer cards, and we have a prayer card that we could talk about even later in the show and what's on there. And then we even have a newsletter of stories and inspiration, how what's going on in the global picture for people to be encouraged by, inspired, to remember and be involved with what's going on.
So your story with Spirit of Martyrdom really began around the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. Tell us a little bit about your background with this event.
Yeah, the Lord really knit me into this work and this global work around the world with prayer. As I was preparing for this podcast, I had forgotten how much the IDOP had played as a part of today, the reason I'm serving the persecuted church. And so it's interesting for me to go back in my mind to think about all these parts that God put together. But I was in youth ministry for years. And then at the end of that season during the 90s, I was really seeking the Lord for what was next. And lo and behold, little did I know, God was orchestrating a global work of international attention for churches to start praying. And so as I'm seeking the Lord for what's next, all of a sudden I start hearing about the persecuted church, and then I hear about this International Day of the Persecuted Church. And one of those guys, his name was Steve Haas, that got involved in a young time, and I met him and just so happened to visit his church, and he was talking about it. It was just crazy, all these details that came together. And later then, I ended up meeting one of the persons that God used to really get this going. His name is Gitana. And Gitana is from Ethiopia. He ultimately founded the Watch and Prayer Ministry. He's a truly gentle man whose face radiates just the love of Jesus. And his passion is for Northeast Africa, around the area he's from. And from a young age, when he was really captured by Christ, he began to preach the gospel. And that was during the time the communists took control in that area of the world. And the communists arrested Gitana for his faith. During that time, he was repeatedly denied food, water, and sleep for days. They even tortured him with boiling oil. He was hung upside down, Mark, and poured on the soles of his feet, which how much our feet are tender. But many nerve endings there, and they poured oil on the bottom of his feet, where he even has scars today.
Oh, wow.
He was whipped with a metal cable during that time, and he spent some years in prison for his faith in Jesus. He eventually escaped and fled to the neighboring country there in 1994. Ultimately, was able to refugee over to the United States. And that's where kind of his story is picked up, because he becomes a house servant for Michael Horowitz. Now, some people have been around for a while might recognize that name.
Okay.
He worked for President Ronald Reagan, some other presidents. He was the general counsel, office, management of budget. He was a columnist. And here's Mike. Here he is, Gitana, an Ethiopian persecuted believer, working in the house of Michael Horowitz. And Michael is a practicing Jew.
Okay.
And Michael talks about, he begins to get really curious about this man's story. He's such a unique man, and there's a joy in his life, and he's unique. And so Gitana begins to tell his story and his testimony there. Later, even Michael Horowitz is quoted saying this: Pastor Gitana is one of the bravest and most remarkable men I know. Pastor Gitana has been a chosen instrument of hope and progress for the victims of religious persecution throughout the world. Wow. So Michael Horowitz was so captivated that God used a practicing Jew to shake the evangelical world.
Wow.
So it's just, God's ways of using, unique people. And again, one of the chosen people through history to really write the course of the evangelical and the church, especially in the West. And Horowitz then, and this started in the mid-1990s, Horowitz went then on a campaign blitz of trying to wake up the Western church. And Horowitz basically, here's some quotes that we get from Michael Horowitz during that time. Okay. It basically says that evangelicals have become the Jews of the 21st century in much of the world.
Wow.
He says there are three factors that are eerily parallel the situation of the European Jews in the late 1900s and the 20th centuries. One, evangelicals are the perfect scapegoat who pose powerful threats to anti-democratic regimes. Two, Western elites are indifferent about their fate. So he's seen those two together. And then thirdly, he says the Western Christian community has maintained a tongue-tied silence about the ongoing persecution.
So, David, we're going to take a break, but when we get back, I want to continue unpacking this story and go into the next chapter of this, where we talk about how the International Day of Prayer really took root in your heart, and how that is critical to a Spirit of Martyrdom's ministry, and how we can get involved in those who are risking much for Jesus. We'll be right back.
At Risk Radio.
Can you imagine trying to disciple a church with only one Bible? This is Mark Stafford from At Risk Radio, and our contacts in Venezuela are telling us incredible stories about people coming to know Jesus, all the while pastors are missing Bibles for their people. After receiving a Bible from our ministry, one man said with tears in his eyes, "No one has ever given me such a beautiful gift." At Risk Radio, in our partnership with SOM International, is working to bring 2 million Bibles into Venezuela. For more information about how you can help, go to atriskradio.com. Welcome back to At Risk Radio. I'm online with David Witt. David Witt is the CEO of SOM International. Now, David, we were talking about the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church, and prayer has really been a critical component to what you do with SOM, and a critical component to how you're serving the persecuted church. Tell us a little bit more about how prayer is interwoven into Spirit of Martyrdom's ministries.
Yeah. So again, as I looked back on my history, the history of the prayer for the persecuted church here, I realized how it's been integral in started so much work and fruit. I believe, I'm not sure if I remember exactly, but I believe the first International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church was 1996. I know for me it was for sure, but I believe that was. And that's when God was getting a hold of my heart. And I just began to, everywhere I went, I read a book, I read an article, and then this prayer movement started. We did it in the church I was involved in there during those days in Colorado. And so in 1998, then the Lord begins to leads me to work for the ministry Voice of the Martyrs, who I spent 10 years with them and have just a labor of love for all that I was impacted by during those years. And so I was able to observe what God was doing during this prayer movement, that happened around the world, where they estimate over 400,000 churches were certainly involved certainly in those days for sure. And in those beginning days for speaking on behalf of the persecuted church, I was speaking 7 7 to 11 times, Mark, a week for churches and, and groups and organizations, Bible studies on and on. There was so much of a hunger. It was like, it's like the church in America came out of a sleep and they're going, well, what is this?
Now, you said before that part of the eerily parallel situation with the European Jews is that it says the Western elites are indifferent about the fates of these, the fates of this religious persecution, and you also just mentioned that back then there was 400,000 churches involved. Are we seeing a similar slide right now that people are unaware of what's happening with the persecuted church, or they're not as concerned about it?
Well, yeah. So I think that's what happened, is that literally nobody knew persecution was going on. Most Christians didn't. The few that didn't really know what to do about it. And so all of a sudden, God made this swell of cooperation, collaboration, and churches got on board. And so I saw from 1998 to 2005, churches were so hungry and conferences on that I was booking speaking engagements 6 to 12 months in advance. But then there was something happened in 2005, I think with 9/11 and just the Islamic terrorism conflict. People were getting overwhelmed, and then get into 2008, the economic recession and everything else. And I do think there has been a lulling back to sleep, and so I think you're catching that well. And Mark, on the subject, I'm curious: was it with us that you first heard about the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church, or had you heard about it before?
I had heard about it before, and in the church I was serving at, we would take out a Sunday and typically pray for those for people who are in chains. We were sensitive to that, but I know that's not entirely common in the Christian church right now. At least I don't think it is. Mm-hmm. And I know that's something that SOM would really love to change.
Yeah, exactly. We're trying to engage the body of Christ to keep God's global church front and center, because it's front and center before the Lord himself. I mean, God sees the host of heaven. He sees his children. And so what's most on the Father's heart needs to be on our heart. Mm-hmm. And we have such a great example of what the International Day of Prayer of Persecuted Church has done for us through, now almost, what would that be, going towards almost 30 years here, right. 25 years. So is what it started. And prayer does that. It starts at our heart, that we can ignite our communities. Because one of the other things I just want to point out that came out of that is in 1998, the House passed and then reconfirmed by the Senate, and it was the International Religious Freedom Act, which basically started for the State Department to make countries of particular concern, and they then record that and they put pressure on nations that are not giving freedom of belief. And so the State Department right now, you could go online, look at that, and they make the annual report on international religious freedom, which describes the status of religious freedom on every country. The report covers government policies that are violating religious beliefs and practices of groups of religious denominations and individuals, and the U.S. Policies to promote religious freedom around the world. So each year that's put out. So that's been a very helpful tool for even our, government to have influence. But the only way that's going to be prioritized by our government and by people is people are praying and they're advocating and they're speaking up for that. We need this day of prayer to keep it so that we're advocating for believers around the world and they're praying to advocate for us, because we are one family.
Okay, David, is this a widespread problem? You gave it these numbers up front, but sometimes I think that people in the church think there's only just a handful of persecuted nations. Is this a widespread problem? Why should people get involved? Why should we be so concerned about the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church?
Yeah, Mark Gray, you're just hitting so much of our passion and certainly our soapbox, what we try to communicate on a regular basis that we have on a lot of our material. And let me put a story. This last week, I was meeting with some men's ministry leaders who were networking together for the men's movements and how we're trying to contribute that to the global church for men to be discipled in a global perspective. And one of the leaders was looking at our stuff, and he picked up the card, the contact card, and he saw on the bottom how, we have these two circles, and on the circles, they have 40% and 3%. He says, David, today, if I've learned anything, he said, the thing that I'm most powerful about, that has really struck my heart, that I'm like humbled at this moment. And he read it out loud to me. He said, 40% of the world has never heard about Jesus. And only 3% of all the Christian giving goes to the most persecuted and unreached 40%. And he said, that every man needs to know.
Right. Well, now, David, you mentioned that you speak to groups about the persecuted church. And of course, you'd love to get into some places to speak to men's groups, speak to Sunday school classes, speak to church congregations. If somebody wants to book you or somebody from Spirit of Martyrdom, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, they can go on spiritofmartyrdom.com, and there's a place there you can request a speaker. And also we have a whole pack to be able to share with your church, your friends, just to be an influence in your area. We can give you bulk newsletter, bulk prayer cards. And the prayer cards this year, we're going over the Indian subcontinent, which is some of the highest persecuted and unreached, the Muslim world and Latin America, and some amazing things that God is doing.
Well, we want to encourage you to get involved with the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church, and we want you to be involved all the time with those who risk much for Jesus. You can get involved by going to spiritofmartyrdom.com, subscribe to the newsletter, and we'll give you the latest news about what's going on with those who are risking much for Jesus. Our full color newsletter comes out every month, and it features stories from those who are serving on the front lines in the most restricted areas of the world. You can sign up for that at spiritofmartyrdom.com. You can also help this podcast by subscribing, by sharing it with a friend, or by leaving a comment. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love your help in connecting others with the information that's provided during this podcast.
Mark, I just want to leave everybody with this final thought. We're a leadership podcast, Mark, as we always talk about, and leaders pray, and people who pray have influence. They lead the world to righteousness. So I'm just inviting all you leaders out there to really consider getting involved with us, join us in a global prayer for our persecuted family.
Well, until next time, my name is Mark Stafford, and this has been At Risk Radio.
You've been listening to At Risk Radio. For more, go to atriskradio.com. At Risk Radio is a production of SOM International.